All right, ready to boost your English skills? Today, we're going deep, diving into how to talk about prices. Think of it like your language toolkit for scoring those online deals or navigating those busy markets when you're traveling. We're using a cool episode from English for Everyday Life called How Much? Master English for Asking About Prices. It's going to be our guide.
Yeah, but it's not just about, memorizing phrases. It's what's really fascinating is how language and culture kind of like mix when you talk about money.
Right.
We'll break down some subtle strategies. You could use them to be polite, but also assertive, even even a little playful, depending on the situation.
I like it. Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start with those basics. The podcast, it really pushes how important it is to have a strong vocabulary. It's like building a house, right? You got to have those strong bricks so that those words like price, cost, and worth, then you can start adding, all the fancy decor.
Right, exactly. Imagine like you're trying to connect with a vendor in another country.
Yeah.
But you can't even say if something's too expensive or if you can afford it.
Right.
It's like you're trying to play like a beautiful song on a piano, but half the keys are missing.
Yeah, that's definitely going to sound a little off. Okay, so let's say we've got our vocabulary toolbox, it's ready. The podcast then jumps into those common scenarios, the ones you bump into when you're dealing with prices. First up, how to ask how much something costs. Now, you might think, okay, easy. How much is this? But there are a bunch of ways to ask, depending on, where you are, who you're talking to.
Yeah, and this is where understanding the little differences is really important. The podcast, it highlights how the phrase you choose can say a lot,
Yeah.
like how formal you're being or what kind of relationship you want to build with the seller. A casual, how much is this? Could be perfect if you're at like a street market.
Right.
But if you're in a fancy boutique,
Yeah.
maybe, could you tell me the price of this, please? That might be better.
So it's all about fitting in. You wouldn't wear like sweatpants to a fancy party.
Right, exactly.
And speaking of finding the right fit, what about when you want to compare prices or see if there's, a better deal hiding somewhere?
Well, this is where it gets a little strategic. The podcast, it suggests phrases like, how much is this compared to that one? Or even being a little bolder, do you have something, a bit cheaper? It's about knowing what you're doing and understanding how to, go back and forth, especially in places where it's normal to bargain.
No, that's a good point. Is there a chance you might seem rude if you try to haggle in a place where it's not really done?
Oh, absolutely. Haggling, it's a delicate dance. Cultural norms, they're super important. In some cultures, it's expected. They even like it. It's a way to connect. But in others, it could be disrespectful.
Oh, wow.
It's about reading the room.
Yeah. So it's like you're learning the steps to a dance, but you also need to know which dance floor you're on.
Exactly. The podcast, it really emphasizes that. Cultural awareness, it's key. Before you travel, do a little research. What are the customs like? Even simple things like your body language or the tone of your voice. It can change how people see you when you're trying to bargain.
Wow. That's a lot to keep in mind. Okay, so we've covered how to ask about prices and even, touched on that haggling thing. But let's be honest. Sometimes we just want to know, are there any discounts, any sales? I mean, who doesn't love a good deal?
Right. And this is where being proactive can really pay off. The podcast says, don't just wait for those sale signs, Go ahead and ask, is this on sale? Or are there any discounts? You might be surprised.
Yeah. So it's like you're a detective looking for clues to unlock those hidden savings. It's making me want to go shopping right now, just to try out some of these phrases.
Well, hold on to your wallet for a second, because we haven't even talked about what if you're the one being asked about the price.
Oh, yeah. That's a whole other side to this. It's like being put on the spot. You're taking a pop quiz.
And just like a pop quiz, be clear, be concise. Those simple phrases like, it costs $50 or the price is $50.
Right.
They get the job done. But the podcast, it also says you can add details, like if there's a discount or a special offer, especially if you want to make that sale.
So it's like you're adding the final touches to your masterpiece. You're making it look even better for the buyer.
Right, exactly. And just like an artist might highlight certain details in their painting, you can highlight the value. Like, it's usually $60, but today it's on sale for $50. Or you get 10% off if you buy two.
Oh, that's a good one. I'm going to remember that one. I have a feeling these tips, they're going to come in handy next time I'm at the craft fair. Speaking of which, how do we deal with those situations where, a little friendly haggling is what's expected?
That's where things get really interesting. And we'll dive deeper into that, into the art of the haggle. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll look at the phrases, the psychology, even those nonverbal cues that can help you get the price you want.
All right, so we've got the foundation for talking about prices. Now let's jump into that exciting world of haggling. I'm imagining a busy marketplace, maybe somewhere, exotic, where you can smell the spices and hear everyone bartering.
Ah, yes. Haggling, it's almost like a performance in some places,
Yeah.
a dance between the buyer and the seller. It's not just the words, it's the gestures, the pauses, that back and forth that gets you to a price everyone's happy with.
But before we get carried away, let's talk about the practical stuff. What phrases does the podcast suggest for those times when we want to, test the waters, see if we can get a better price?
Well, they suggest starting politely, but being direct. Like, can you do any better on this price? Or is there any room for negotiation? These phrases show you're interested in a lower price, but you're not, you know, being aggressive about it.
Right. So it's like dipping your toes in the water before you jump in. But what about when the first price they give you is way too high? Is there a way to counter that, to offer a lower price without, making them mad?
That's where understanding what they call anchoring comes in. The podcast talks about how the first number that gets thrown out there, it can really affect the final price.
Yeah.
If you start low but reasonable, it changes things. It might get you a better deal.
Oh, interesting. So it's like you're setting the scene for the whole negotiation. If you start low but not crazy low, it gives you more room to move around. And I guess your tone of voice matters too, right? And your body language.
Absolutely. Haggling, it's all about balance. You got to be assertive but respectful.
Hmm.
Even if you're offering a lower price, being friendly, being respectful, it can really help keep things smooth.
So it's not about bullying. It's about, being a good communicator, using your words and your body to get your message across. But what about when the seller, they're really stuck on their price? How do we know when to push a little harder or when to just, accept it?
That's where you got to read the situation. The podcast, it says, pay attention to what the seller's doing, not just what they're saying.
Yeah.
Are they interested in bargaining, or are they brushing you off? Are they giving you counteroffers, or are they standing firm?
So it's like a poker game almost. You're trying to figure out their tells. But unlike poker, we don't want to walk away with nothing. What are some ways to find that middle ground where both the buyer and seller, they feel good about the deal?
One thing the podcast talks about is the power of compromise. Don't get stuck on one price. Be willing to give a little and find creative solutions. Maybe you buy more things to get a discount, or maybe you meet in the middle on the price.
Right. That makes sense. It's like finding that win-win where everyone's happy. This might be a weird question, but I've heard that in some places, being quiet can actually be helpful when you're bargaining. Is that something the podcast mentions?
That's a good point. And yeah, they do talk about that, about how silence can be different in different cultures. In some places, it's seen as a sign of respect. It means you're thinking things over.
Hmm.
It can give the seller time to think about your offer without feeling pressured.
So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It could just mean they're thinking. That's interesting. It seems like every culture has its own way of doing things when it comes to haggling.
Exactly. That's what makes it so interesting. The podcast encourages people to embrace all those different ways of doing things
Yeah.
and to see haggling not just as a transaction, but as a cultural exchange. It's a chance to learn something, connect with someone, and maybe even come away with a story to tell.
I like that. It takes the pressure off and makes the whole thing more fun. Speaking of stories, I remember this one time I was in a market in Morocco. It was amazing. So many colors, and the smells were incredible. And I saw this rug, this beautiful rug, hand woven, but the price, the vendor, he wanted it was a little high for me.
Oh, I bet. Sounds intense. Did you try to haggle?
I did, yeah. I remember that thing about anchoring. So I offered him like way less, trying to seem, confident but also respectful. And we went back and forth for a while. A little English, some gestures, lots of smiling. In the end, we got to a price we both felt good about.
Nice. Sounds like you handled it perfectly.
Yeah.
Shows what the podcast was saying,
Mm.
In a lot of cultures, haggling, it's not just about getting the cheapest price. It's like a social thing. You build a connection.
Yeah. It totally felt like that. We even shared some mint tea
Hmm.
while we were finishing up the deal. It was a way better experience than just, swiping a card. But I was wondering, the podcast mentions that talking about money, it can be a touchy subject, especially in some cultures. How do we avoid, saying the wrong thing? Especially
That,
when we're traveling.
That's a really good point. And it comes down to knowing about the culture. The podcast says that in some cultures, being direct about money, it's fine. But in others, it's seen as rude, even taboo. Like in some Asian cultures, there's this thing called face. It's super important.
Yeah, I've heard of that, but I don't really get what it means like in this context.
It's kind of complicated, but basically face means like your reputation, your
Yeah.
dignity, your standing in society.
Hmm.
And in these cultures, talking about money openly, especially if it sounds like you're saying someone's stuff isn't worth much, it can make them lose face.
Oh, okay. So what if you think the price is too high? How do you say something without, making them lose face?
The podcast, it suggests you focus on the item itself instead of, directly saying the price is bad. Like you can say, this is beautiful, but it's a bit more than I was planning to spend. Would you maybe consider a lower price?
Right. That makes sense. You're still talking about the price, but you're not like attacking them or making them feel bad.
Exactly. And remember, how you act matters too. Your tone of voice, your body language. If you show that you appreciate their work, it can build trust, make everyone feel good.
So it's about finding that balance, right? Between saying what you need, but also being aware of the culture and not being offensive.
Yeah, that's it. And like the podcast says, even if you mess up, it's a chance to learn. Most people, they appreciate it when you're trying to understand their culture, even if you make a few mistakes.
I think our listeners, they're ready to handle any price situation now. They've got the words, the phrases, the strategies, and most importantly, they know that language, it's not just about words.
It really isn't. It's about understanding, connecting with people, and navigating all those, those little things that make us human. Yeah, who would have thought that asking how much could be so complicated and so interesting?
That's a great point to wrap things up. So, to our listeners, we challenge you go out there, try your new skills. Don't be afraid to start conversations, try different things, maybe even share your stories with us. Until next time, happy learning and happy haggling.